Okay, apropos ARP, might seem a little enigmatic, but it is enigmatic as a title. I apologize for that. So I think I should probably start with a few words about the subject of this talk. Okay, so I'll look at the ways, some of the ways in which artists working in Britain have engaged with art sculpture over recent decades. And I will give brief coverage of several artists and their artworks from the 1980s to now. And I quote from several interviews I've conducted with living artists about ARP. So in terms of the title, Apropos ARP, I'm using the poetry of the word apropos, kind of schematically, slightly a clumsy, but maybe I hope helpful way, schematically, to look at two, as I see it, two main types of artistic engagement. So firstly, apropos ARP, meaning art made by way of his work or through the example of his work. I think Pepe yesterday gave us a very, very good, diverse account of that kind of, engagement, very specific or very loose or just in the ether, in the zeitgeist of the work. So that kind of work. So for myself, I'm looking at the sculpture in particular. So artists making work are interested in developing and extending the formal language of figurative and abstract sculpture. Their interest tends to focus on the experience of figuration, the internal, formal, and emotional dynamics of sculpture. The second apropos art, meaning art made concerning or relating to or about ARP's work. So artists making work, this kind of work, are addressing or appropriating aspects of ARP's work, his identity or his practice. So such work is often made, as I hope I can show you, with a complex blend of homage and caricature. And though they look back at ARP's work, they represent it in the here and now. They pull it into the present in very curious and interesting ways. So to think about the first, through ARP. Images such as these from the 1950s and 60s coincided with increasing attention that art was receiving in Britain in these decades. They were decades in which the caricatural idea of modern sculpture as an organic, biomorphic looking object with a hole in it was becoming very widespread, and any number of cartoons and magazines give evidence to this. So all kinds of things happening through and around these biomorphic holes. But there were serious holes. I mean, modern sculptures increasingly wore these holes, these voids, as badges of honor and markers of their modernity. In Britain, Moore and Hepworth and their work were experiencing a similar photographic reception. Such images are, of course, more than just neat compositional devices. They show artists intimately in contact with their work. The works are of them as much as by them, emphasizing the hand and the touch of the artist. They present a view of the artist, both seen through the frame of the work, whilst also serving as the background of the work, connecting object, body, and context. And in doing so, they bring artist, biography, and art object together in curious ways. So a Moore equals Moore, a Hepworth work equals Hepworth, and ARP equals ARP, and so on. For artists working in Britain in these decades and after, the reception of ARP sculpture was often mediated in all kinds of subtle ways by that of Moore and Hepworth. They're seen together as loosely belonging to the same sculptural language. Although it was not always apparent at the time, ARP, of course, was a member of the previous generation. Born in 1877, ARP was 21 years of age in 1898 when Moore was born, and was 26 in 1903 when Hepworth was born. ARP, of course, died in 1966, 20 years before Moore. Connections between them were very heightened when in 1968, the British art writer Herbert Reed, for 40 years closely associated with the work of Moore and Hepworth, published his book on ARP, shown here with ARP's mask-like Ptolemy III on the jacket sleeve cover. Reed's book on ARP mentions Moore and Hepworth only briefly in the last pages of the book. He quotes Hepworth on her appraisal of the liberating power of ARP's work, freeing her work from inhibitions and allowing her to see what she called, and I quote, the figure in landscape with new eyes. Reed also points to differences between Moore's work and ARP's approaches to sculpture. Moore's, he states, is more firmly attached to human form, continuing, I think, somewhat ambiguously, ARP's ideal is the fruit that is produced by the plant. Moore's, the human embryo that is molded in the womb. ARP's forms are as free as clouds. Moore's are rooted in substantial soil. In his conclusion, Reed highlights what he sees as ARP's main innovations, including the incorporation of chants, ripped paper collage, and the painted relief. And then he finishes with the really interesting lines. ARP is an artist who influences art itself rather than individual artists. It's a really good point. It's a very convenient way, in a way, to negotiate the Hepworth-Moore ARP triangle, but it's a very important point. I think in a way that could serve as a kind of subtitle for this first part of the talk. But there are particularities and particular engagements. So Nicholas Pope. So for a sculptor like Nick Pope, who was born in 1949, same generation as Cragg, Gormley, Woodrow, the new British Sculpture Group, ARP offered a way of thinking beyond Moore and Hepworth through different scapes and through different sculptural energies. Not only beyond plinths, but also beyond the bases of Brancusi, beyond contemporary figurations, but also beyond the mannequins of surrealist-inspired work, beyond constructivism, but also beyond the orthogonal geometries of minimalism. ARP allowed Pope to explore fantastical organic forms and enabled him to work with solid, heavy materials like stone and wood in idiosyncratic ways and with a lightness of touch. These two works, shown here in stone and wood, use the idea of unknown landscapes, one perhaps suggestive of cloud formations and the other a kind of biomorphic structure for viewers to stand behind or in front of, framed by the work, a little like those photos we've just seen. This larger stone work, which might recall ARP's Entwined Connections of 1958, which is used as a poster image for this conference, stands as a kind of giant head mask, inviting viewers to look through its apertures, briefly entering the orbit of the work. Like Pope, the late Philip de Barlow credited ARP explicitly for the way in which he enabled her work to deal with sculpture's supports. Describing Memorial Place, which I'm showing you on the right, she comments, "It was made by going back to some of my earlier works, which I made on plaster cushions, which were very influenced by ARP. I have always really loved ARP's work. I wanted to use these pillows, which were a kind of starting point. They created a space for my work." So again, we find ARP offering a way back into sculptural basics, supports, but also a way of creating space for her own work, using soft-looking forms with hard material. For Eilish O'Connell, based in Cork, in Ireland, ARP sculpture always inspires her to go further, beyond the human body. And I quote, "To always try and make something I've never seen before." The approach she takes in her own work, making all of a piece combinations of grown and made forms, also shows her eye for the hybrid thinking of ARP's plaster sculpture. For the sculptor Joanna Allen, this is very recent work from last year, very recent work. ARP's work is very liberating. She reflects, "I find ARP's work truly courageous. He pursued such an unpolluted representation of the unseen, resisting the urge to manipulate or embellish into something immediately recognizable. This restraint and this simplicity I find in his work and the space around it gives the whole thing room to breathe. And that's what I want in my work. For Allen herself, this unseen is about blending the female form with biomorphic forms, playing a kind of hide and seek with viewers with slick and slippery sensual surfaces. From one view, the work reveals a body, often a pregnant body, a voluminous body. From another, an organic looking abstract form. Before turning to about art, I want to say a few brief words about Tony Cragg. Having lived and worked in Germany since 1977, Cragg is in an excellent position to view the impact of Arp's work and what one might call its Anglo-German resonances. Since the later 1990s, Cragg has been working with plywood to create biomorphic interlocking forms, often columnar forms. Sheets of plywood are compiled to make vertical layered forms and then carved, cut, and sanded down into more complex curvilinear compositions. The stacking, carving, additive, subtractive processes that Cragg and his assistants employ give him the freedom and the flexibility to make sculpture in different forms, to build up and to cut down, to expand and to streamline. And these photos here, of course, are close-ups, giving you some sense of their life in wood prior to casting. This mode of working, this way of constructing and carving his work, for me, gives them a slightly more superficial kind of relation to Arp's model sculptures, since they're born out of compiling and carving. And thinking about Pepe's point last night about lithic biomorphism, we might think of perhaps Cragg's sculptures as being born out of erosion and a weathering down, literally a cutting into the wood, but a weathering, an erosion, as much as a evocation of the look of growth. They have this double-edged thing, but taking away and expanding that Cragg's work has, which we saw in the earlier classical biomorphic work by Arp that you showed last night. So here we have the coffee bean, Cragg's coffee bean looking sculpture that he recently showed outdoors, and it's called integers. The title refers to a mathematical term meaning a whole or prime number, complete in itself. And the sculptural poetry of this word, I think, is really compelling in relation to the ideas of duality and togetherness. The sculpture is made all of a piece, and its smooth, polished forms give a sensual quality to this tightly integrated, conjoined object. Two brief, very brief, in passing footnotes on Cragg's work I'd like to introduce here in relation to Arp that might also point to some interesting sculptural continuities between London and Dusseldorf. Cragg's tutor at the Royal College of Art in the late 70s was a sculptor called Bernard Meadows. He was a member of the so-called Geometry of Fear 1952 Venice Biennale group of artists. He was an early assistant to Henry Moore in the 1930s and remained a supporter of Moore and his work for many years. As can be seen here with his pointing figures, Arp's work had a striking impact on his sculpture in the 60s and 70s, enabling him to move beyond the example of Moore and make sculpture that blended animal and vegetable forms. Secondly, looking ahead, Wilhelm Mundt was one of Cragg's early students at the Dusseldorf Academy, later becoming his first ever studio assistant. Mundt's trash stones demonstrate his self-declared journey out of the example of Moore and Arp, which first inspired him to become a sculptor. Each of his trash stones comprise studio debris, which has been bundled up together and then sealed with fiberglass and layers of glossy plastic to create striking mixed media biomorphic formations. A few words now about part two of this talk, about Arp. And I'm going to look at the work of Paul McDevitt, Tim Etchells, and Elm Green and Dragset. Although Paul McDevitt was born in Leeds, in Yorkshire, the county of Moore and Hepworth, as you know, he's been living in Berlin for 20 years. Talking with him recently about his fascination with ARP, he talked straight away about mixing up both Moore and Hepworth as an art student. And then later on saying that he was, and I quote, really drawn to ARP's work because of its cartoon flatness. Even a lot of the sculptures are flat. I love the automatic drawing, being open to chance. And I see his influence in the most unexpected of places, such as product design and typographic design. Much of McDevitt's practice revolves around drawing. I'm showing you a couple here. His copy of Herbert Reed's 1968 book on ARP is very well thumbed. Here we see him take two specific art sculptures, Dreaming Star on the left of 1958 and Bird Skeleton, 1952 on the right. And he builds narratives around them, taking the objects and their viewers out of doors and creating chance encounters for objects that are themselves perhaps evocative of chance. Some of the sets and the stories that McDevitt parachutes them into stemmed from a project he did for ArtSpeak in Vancouver in 2009. He recalls, the gallery was closed for renovation, so I had to come up with something off-site. I proposed to spend 2 weeks drawing in the wilderness of British Columbia. I was sitting in the absolute middle of nowhere, hours from any town, and with nothing around me other than mountains, trees, and animals. It was so beautiful that it was really hard to work there. I mean, how do you compete with that? I was thinking, what would it be like to encounter something alien in that environment, something that doesn't belong there and yet is supposedly informed by the contours of the natural world? I was probably missing the urban environment. I also found a salt lick on a farm, which reminded me of that kind of biomorphic sculpture. And I used that in some of the images too. As I bring this talk to a close, I'd like to look at the fascinating example of drama queens by the artist duo Michael Elmgreen and Ingard Dragset. And many of you, of course, I'm sure would have seen this play and maybe the film of it. The play, Drama Queens, was their response to the invitation to take part in the 2007 Munster Sculpture Project. They knew they wanted to have their contribution staged within the impressive mid-century architecture of the Stadttheater Munster. It was to be a play about sculpture with different kinds of 20th century sculpture superstars, each representing different periods and different positions. The artist duo didn't write the text of the play themselves, but they contacted the British writer and artist Tim Etchells, commissioning him to write the script. And I talked to Tim, recently at length about his text and looking back, over nearly 20 years ago, and what he remembered about the commission and the writing. It was, from the outset, to be a play of inversions in which sculptures move about the stage, talking to each other, whilst the viewers, or obviously audience, remain still, seated and silent. Written as a tragi-comedy, there is much dramatic irony in Etchells' texts, as well as jokes about viewing conditions, presentation, visibility, space, touch, animation, and of course, silence. The final group of sculptors were Arp's Cloud Shepherd, 1953, Giacometti's Walking Man, Koons's Rabbit, Solowit's Four Cubes, Hepworth's Elegy 3, a block of granite inspired by a 1984 Ulrich Ruckheim sculpture, and finally Andy Warhol's Brillo Box, 1964, which makes a dramatic, game-changing entrance at the very end of the play. It was fascinating to learn from Etchells that other sculptures were considered at an earlier point. Calder Moore, Boyce, Morris, Judd, Bourgeois, and Brancusi, the latter a bird in space, talking with a French-Romanian accent. The final works were chosen by Elmgreen and Dragset, with Etchells using elements from each of the artist's biographies for his characterizations. His characterization of Arp's Cloud Shepherd draws upon Arp's place in art history very strongly. In the play, he comes across as a helpful, guiding presence, as Etchells recalls, as someone who has experienced both world wars, with feet in both Dada and Surrealism, responding to all that turmoil, change, and upheaval. I think that made him a very good figure for the play. He continues, Cloud Shepherd is an interlocutor, taking a little bit of social responsibility for the situation they all find themselves in, alongside the slightly cliched idea of being a bit whimsical, a bit dreamy, a little bit head in the clouds. Certainly not in the same egotistical mode as the rabbit, the walking man, and other figures in the play. As one of the few poets amongst this group of sculptors, Etchells paid special attention to Arp's writing as well as his sculptures. Arp's Cloud Shepherd was a work that Arp himself had already written about. And Etchells has the sculpture in Drama Queens recite Arp's 1938 poem, The Feet of Morning. According to Etchells, and I quote, Arp's poem is very much about an object that is mutating and transforming, and also one that relates to the forms of the Cloud Shepherd sculpture. What we've got in Drama Queens is a performance that is about a set of objects that are discovering themselves as beings, so that they all share this really weird state of being and half-being. I think that the Cloud Shepherd has some really good lines in the poem about what it is to be an object that is transforming or in the processes of changing. To end, despite its comic elements, there is a real poignancy to Drama Queens that is in no small part comes from this situation. Our sense of these sculptures, predicaments. For Etchells, this was something that he really wanted to develop, inviting us to ponder their lives before the play and, of course, after this performance. He recalls, the topic of museum storage was both a kind of joke, but also an existential despair for these sculptures. You hear them saying, sometimes I'm in storage and nobody comes by. I'm just sitting there on my own, sitting in the dark, sitting in a box. It's a kind of cod existential philosophical question, I know, but I think it's great for the play to have fun with this, have fun with them wondering about their status, where they're going. At the end, when they're all going off the stage one by one, you get a real sense they're not going back to the gallery. They're not going back to the storeroom. But where are they going? And he concludes, now I think that is a really, really beautiful thing. We've seen them come to life, and they are now in the world. They're not going back to the museum store. They're just going for a walk. Or they're going somewhere else. They're just spinning out in the world. And that's a really, really interesting transformation that we as viewers get to see. And most importantly, as they leave the stage, they leave us, the audience, alone as well. We've been watching them all this time, waiting for something to happen, and suddenly they're gone. And we're left with, would the last one please turn out the lights? Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jonathan. It was quite, I thought, a touching presentation, especially having the time to look at Remember this play and these amazing artists, Elmstead and Granstead, to use the ARP image in such prominent context. Thank you for that. May I ask for questions? Pepe.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. I was very impressed by the play at the end, and I wondered, it reminded me of Oscar Schlemmer's Triadic Ballet earlier or in the 20th century. And what happens when these abstract, supposedly inanimate forms start taking flight or acting and becoming alive on stage? How are they transformed? How does it change us?
I was very lucky to have a chance to talk with Tim, who did the play, who wrote the play. And I'd always thought about the work as an art historian as a visual piece. I was interested in who made the works, who made the motors, you know, whose voices, and so on. But what Tim was really good at was talking a lot about precisely that topic, that your question, about human beings' inabilities or real difficulty to imagine a voice that's not located in an object. You know, thus ventriloquism, the charm of, I mean, the idea of radio ventriloquism is absurd, but it's a reality, radio ventriloquism. So that really came home to me, that the sculpture and voices, and the one's imagining of an inner life of a sculpture, an essence of a sculpture, and one's imagination of an inner voice of a sculpture are very, very close together. One can almost, in a way, talk about essence as voice. And when that sculpture is actually given the voice, it becomes doubly kind of crazy and enthralling and compelling in the way that you just highlighted. And I think for the work I've done on sculpture over the years, I've been very, very intrigued by those moments in many practices, as you know, where voice is introduced and the sculptors turn to audio to enhance or develop their ideas. I think they can be extraordinary things. And there are a lot of them nowadays, a lot of sculptors resorting to audio and to sound. So anyway, that's my response to your very good question.